can get started. We're 3 minutes past, and then folks will join us when they can. So thank you, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Kristen Verastro, pronouns she, her. I am the head of legal recruiting at SingleSprout. A bit about myself. I'm a former practicing attorney, been recruiting attorneys for the past about 6 years or so. SingleSprout is a recruiting company. We focus on helping high growth and cutting edge technology companies grow, staff, hire for their technology teams and their legal teams. On the legal side, our focus is on attorneys from hiring at the CLO GC level through more entry level positions like associate corporate counsel, commercial counsel, et cetera, and everything in between. And we work with companies at all sizes and stages from seed through IPO, public, et cetera. So we are thrilled to be here today. I'll pop my email in the chat if anyone has any questions about SingleSprout. It's our honor to be partnered with All Voices. A tiny bit about All Voices, if you are not familiar. All Voices is an employee feedback management platform. It enables employees to anonymously and safely report harassment, bias, culture issues directly to company leadership. They collect that anonymous data and share it with company leaders so they can take action. And with that, companies have real-time proactive data that helps them sort of identify issues before they become systemic problems, which obviously helps improve culture and provide a safe space for employees to feel heard. So we have Christina Giordano on the line today from All Voices. She'll drop her email in the chat if you have any questions about that. Thanks, Christina. From a technical note, the chat will be open the whole webinar. Feel free to pop your questions in there. Ultimately, we hope to have some time for questions and answers at the end. If a panelist happens to see your question and has a moment to answer during the panel, though I'm not sure that'll be possible, we can answer and chat throughout, but feel free to pop your questions in there. I think that's it for logistics. We will start with our panelists, who thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited to have each of you. Why don't each of you introduce yourselves and briefly, give a short explanation of your experience and kind of relevant to today's topic, and we'll start there. Meredith, why don't you kick it off? I just pulled someone out of thin air.
Hi, everyone. My name is Meredith Jolivert. I am General Counsel at POLITICO. I've been in seat for a year. It is an incredibly exciting company and an exciting time. I'm building my team now. I rely heavily on outside counsel and also on the various partners I have in the business to get all of the work done that I do. My practice focuses largely on First Amendment defamation issues, so media issues. Now labor and employment, as well as contracts, because we have a thriving B2B side of our business.
I'll go next. I'm Sharon Zezima. I first of all want to say I'm an advisor to All Voices, just in full disclosure, also a big supporter of the company and tool. I have been a senior legal leader in tech companies for the last 20 years, first as a deputy general counsel at EA, and then as general counsel at Marketo, GoPro, Pax Labs, and most recently Acoustic, where I was general counsel as well as chief data ethics officer. And at two of those companies where I was GC, I was the first lawyer in and brought it from private to public. And in two of the others, there were an existing legal team that required some reorganization and work when I got there.
Hi, I'm Elena Cecile. I am our general counsel at Sonos. My pronouns are she, her, I should say. General counsel at Sonos for pretty much everywhere but Europe. I am also just recently resigned from being our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, so I had that role as well, and I'm also our Assistant Secretary. I have been at Sonos about 8 years and have sort of done a wide range of the jobs there and helped build our team, everything from contracts to employment to leading the team for a period of time, and we also we just implemented All Voices at Sonos. So happy to be on this panel with everyone.
Hi, I'm Cecile. So excited to join this distinguished slate of panelists today. So I'm the general counsel at Eden Health. We provide primary care through both telemedicine and in clinics, and we combine the current, standard notion of primary care with a much broader area of range of services, including mental health, healthcare navigation, physical therapy, and we also provide services to employers related to managing the pandemic, so tracking vaccinations for COVID and COVID testing and all that good stuff. I'm building the legal team at Eden, and I've done it before. I was the first lawyer previously at Revel and the general counsel there. I built a legal team there, and before that, I was the deputy general counsel and second member of the legal team at VIA, and the legal team grew from 2 to 12 while I was there. So excited to talk about building legal teams today.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. Again, we're happy to have you, and we'll start right there. There are, again, kind of two major topics of interest that we're going to cover today: how to design your legal team and how to cultivate meaningful partnerships. So we'll start with how to design your legal team. Obviously, it's a big question if you're the first legal hire at a company, but also relevant. I think Sharon touched on this. If you inherit a team and you may want to restructure it, or if you've been in a position for quite a while and maybe the company has grown and the legal team structure that was working previously isn't as much in line with the business side anymore. There's lots of reasons why designing your legal team would be on someone's mind. Let's start with Cecile on this one. I know you said you've been the first legal hire in two places and helped grow teams. So what are some of your thought processes around, deciding who to hire first, or what direction you go for your first hire?
Yeah, it's so challenging, right? Because typically you get in there and then it's trial by fire, at least in my experience. People have somehow been waiting for you for a long time, and the first challenge is bandwidth. And even if you're lucky enough to have the budget to recruit a team, you need to think about the time it takes to recruit. And so what I've liked to do is take a step back, take a little bit of time to assess the volume of work in different areas and think about what could fill up an FTE's time, and where you could hire someone that could be a valuable resource. In this case at Eden, I've pretty quickly hired a commercial and corporate counsel because we offer our services as B2B, and so we have a lot of a high volume of work in the transactional area. But then you also think about your own skills versus other skills that might be needed on the team, right? And so you also want to think about hiring people whose skills are complementary to yours. And so in my case, this was my first role in healthcare. So I also have another team member who's joining actually at the end of this month as regulatory counsel, who's got that healthcare regulatory background. My advice would be really look at in those first couple of months, or even those first few weeks, what you're spending your time on and what you should be spending your time on. And are there things that you are doing that could be delegated to someone and that could fill an FTE? There's other types of resources otherwise, right? So I've various points throughout my career, I've worked with temporary resources, typically for vendor contracts and things like that, where you can get someone who's like sort of embedded in your team, but who's maybe working for 10 hours or 15 hours a week, and freeing up some capacity there. And then I would also say, don't underestimate the value of non-lawyer positions. I think someone who's a paralegal or a legal operations associate who is not a lawyer could be a very effective resource if trained appropriately. And then finally, in terms of the big picture, to get that budget to hire someone, the biggest thing, the most important thing is to prove your value to the business. And I think the way to do that is to go beyond just providing legal advice and to be a real thought partner to the business. So that's probably my biggest, my main piece of advice is if you are in this position where you're hired as the first lawyer, when you get in, the first impressions are really important. So try to really show your value there. And in my experience, if the company's doing well, the budget will follow.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here. So one of the things off the top I think a lot about when we're talking about your legal team is you probably hear HR talk a lot about organizational development and organizational effectiveness of the whole entire org, but that applies equally to the legal department. And I think I learned early on the importance of that and how efficient the legal team is and how well it supports the business. So I always try to kind of keep that in the back of my mind when I'm thinking of the legal organization, how effective it is, the size, where we're going with it, is what, how am I developing that organization and how effective is it in supporting the company? When I got my first GC job, I was the first lawyer in at Marketo, and I didn't have a lot of budget for resources, but the first two hires I made, the first one was a senior transactional number two, sort of along the line of what Cecile was saying. We're a B2B SaaS software company, and so transactional work was just the bread and butter. What is core to your business, and that's what you think about when you're thinking about hiring in-house versus what's done through outside counsel or other ways. And the second was a utility paralegal who could do corporate paralegal work, could do some low-level transactional work, could do some equity work, a kind of, I call them a utility player. And I find, at least for B2B companies, those are really a good, solid first couple of hires. But when I got to GoPro, and I was also the first lawyer in, but it was a much bigger company, a lot more going on, and still being the first lawyer in, a lot of the work was being done by outside counsel, and it was pretty expensive. So I, like Cecile, took time, sat back and said, okay, well, what is really needed to support this organization? And, took a little bit of time to learn the organization. And then what I've done, which is something I've carried with me to every company thereafter and often shared with other new GCs, is a resource plan. So I took a look at what the objectives of the company were, what I thought the objectives of the legal team and function needed to be over the next 1 to 2 years, looked at comparable companies and the size of those companies and the type of hires they had. And then I put together a resource plan. Here's where we are. Here's where we want to be in 12 to 18 months. And that would include the hires I thought of having, the cost of those hires. I would include the objectives of the legal department in that plan, so I could show the executive team how those were matching up to the objectives. The people I was hiring were there to help support the objectives of the legal team and the company. And then I'd include some comparables about what size of legal teams in the type of company, type of industry that I'm in. And doing that was so effective because the COO, the CEO, the CFO, they saw the planning that went into that, the thought that went into that. So when it came around to then arguing for the budget, it made it much easier because people really understood the bigger picture of what I was trying to do. I'll also add just one last thing is there's what you do coming in, and then there's what you do on an ongoing basis. And I think you do need to continue to sort of go back and look at where the organization is and whether it continues to be the right organization, and especially when there's reductions in force, RIFs. Like who are, if your team is impacted, who are the right people that need that unfortunately the roles will be eliminated, and which roles are really critical based on where the company is going in that RIF and after that RIF.
Yeah, I'll just build on the idea of the resource planning. I also, and possibly because Sharon has consulted me over the years, did a similar activity with the resource planning and just thinking ahead to what the team will look like as you go forward. And one thing on that I noted in doing that is having some transparency around that resource plan and what you're hoping to do with your legal team over time, I think is a really good opportunity for folks within the team to maybe understand where there's potential for growth for them, like career growth, and just having that picture, they can sometimes use that to raise their hand and say, hey, I'd like to learn this area, or I'd like to grow in this way. And so it has a sort of dual benefit of, you know, helping people see where you're headed, but then also this sort of development, which ties into retention. So if you want to keep those star players, it might present opportunities for them to grow in meaningful ways.
Yeah, Elena, I think that's a really retention. I've been thinking a lot about lately in terms of remote hiring and managing. And I think we all have fatigue about talking around remote hiring and managing, to the nth degree. But I think there are, a few different angles that have been maybe less discussed. And for me, retention is one of them, obviously, with the market being as busy as it is, fortunately. And many more companies opening up to hiring remotely, there's a host of benefits around that. But on the back end, as a GC, there could be a concern about how do we retain the team that I have. And I think that for me is one of the things that I still think about, even in my role as kind of an outside partner, as something that does come to the forefront with remote hiring and managing. Elena, let me come back to you then, since you brought up retention, but is there anything else that you think, although we've been talking a lot about remote hiring and managing, is there any angle of it that you think has perhaps been not given enough attention, or an area that you think could be discussed further still?
I think one of the silver linings that I don't know how frequently it's discussed is just that by opening it up, as companies look more to increase their DEI practices, like the ability to hire folks in different markets that for whatever reason are probably highly qualified, but just don't live in Silicon Valley or wherever, I think that's a real benefit to get in more people with different types of background, diverse voices, just really expand your team, and even to some extent have different like regional ideas of what's going on. You might see different things in different areas, and just having that wealth of diversity on your team, I think, can really impact your team and help make the whole team stronger. So I would say that that's an area that I think people don't really think about, or maybe it's not as obvious about the remote thing, but it's a really cool thing, and I can't wait to sort of see how it evolves over time.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And, in addition, I'm a working parent. I had a baby in the beginning of the pandemic. And I will say, coming back to work from maternity leave in a remote environment, I think was much easier than it would have been coming back to the office. So, we should take into account the silver linings for sure. There are some unique or I think particularly thoughtful ways that at Eden we've been dealing with the challenges of a remote workforce. As a company that's grown a lot during the pandemic, we've hired throughout the country. So I think we'll be a remote company forever, and so we've sort of adapted our culture and a lot of our processes to that. So we have a daily all hands, which is an opportunity for everyone to connect. We have someone who, with the help of an algorithm, organizes randomized coffee chats just to mix people from various teams together, just to get to know each other through Zoom. We have Zoom parties, which I know a lot of people have been doing Zoom happy hours, but we've been trying to be thoughtful also around like making those more structured to give a fun context and environment. And then we organized a company offsite in September, which was a huge feat. And We did it in the safest way possible. You know, it was vaccinated only. Everyone had to get tested shortly before coming, and being fortunate to be in that space, we're able to facilitate the testing, make it easy for our employees, and have clinical team members who were on call to deal with any positive tests or any sort of questions around it. And it was an amazing event, and people were so excited to get together. So I think that shouldn't be neglected.
So one thing I would add about just, I think the remote is there's opportunity and there's also challenge there. Because I onboarded actually during the pandemic. I joined initially with Politico's former equity owner and then moved to Politico, to the operating company during the pandemic. And it is difficult, especially when you're in a legal position and so much of your work depends on building trust, a trusted relationship with the support, through support services that you're offering to the business. Developing that relationship in a remote environment where you don't have an opportunity to have organic connections that you can make with people. Every time you talk to someone is deliberate and intentional when you're in a remote space. You don't have the opportunity to bump into someone at the coffee machine or in some other way and make a connection with someone. And so I did have to work as someone who onboarded in that process much more to develop that trust and to spend time doing that. I think one of the most effective things that I saw happen during the pandemic was, like within the first 2 weeks of joining, I met in 30-minute one-on-one sessions with every one of my colleagues on the leadership team. And in that time, I was able to talk to them about my experience, learn about their needs, and learn about the opportunities for the legal function to interact with whatever their function happened to be. It was an incredible foundation for the relationships that I've built over the past year. I think one other thing is when you have a mixed team where some people are in person and some people are remote, there could be an over-reliance on the in-person connection that may feel alienating to the people that are not able to come in person. And so I also really try to encourage people to be very thoughtful about equality and inclusion as they're developing the formats for whatever connection opportunities there are, so that the people that remain in a remote space don't feel somehow disconnected from the broader effort, the broader team. And so I think those are things that, even while remote, are effective tools in trying to overcome some of that disconnect that can come in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to be mindful of time here. And I think that's a great transition as you talked about the business side partnerships. I mean, I think first, thank you all on the how to design your team and things you're thinking about front. No matter what the season or time of year, obviously, that's an important focus for GCs to be mindful about building and retaining your team. Second major area we're going to cover today, like I said, I think every strong chief legal executive continually contemplating how to cultivate meaningful partnerships. And there are many, many ways, many different kinds of partnerships that you cultivate as an in-house legal team, whether it's with your outside counsel, your vendors, companies like All Voices and SingleSprout, et cetera. But today we're going to focus on cultivating those meaningful internal partnerships with the business side. And we're going to talk about 3 different hot topic areas, for lack of a better term, where GCs or the legal team often need to collaborate with the business side or compliance team. Those 3 areas being 1, DEI, 2, ESG, and 3, data governance. So DEI has come up already in our discussion in a few different ways. So let's kind of start there, I guess, of the 3. As a GC, you often have some level or some opportunity to have a level of involvement with steering or being a part of a company's committee that works on DEI. What's one area you feel the GC can really impact in relationship to DEI? And we can go back and start with Meredith on this one.
Sure. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. I think one thing to be mindful of is equal opportunity and the requirements under the Department of Labor are something we have to keep at the front of mind. And sometimes those requirements to provide equal access and equal opportunity in hiring and recruitment can feel like they're at odds with a push to diversify a workforce. So I think it's important to be clear about what the requirements are and to ensure and sort of affirm that you are working in partnership with the business in developing the right policies and procedures. I think you can really diffuse any of that seeming conflict by understanding what the objectives are and by really being a thought partner in developing a plan that's going to work for the organization. So, a couple of points, right? Listening to understand rather than to respond, right? Walking in and really trying to understand what the goals are and where the company has come from, because often the future is shaped by the past. And so there could be other mechanisms that can be used, again, to help shape the inclusivity piece of things, to help diversify how to actually frame up or define diversity. There's some real foundational tenets that have to be adopted and embraced and that have to be uniformly agreed to, I think, to develop the architecture that's needed to have a good policy. And so starting to think about those things in principle form before you add too much detail there, I think starts the conversation at sufficiently high level so that you can reach agreement, so that you can have a digestible and repeatable sentiment that can come as well, which I think is good for people to share with their teams and to, and create some excitement around. And then to make sure that there is a real understanding of what the legal requirements are as you're doing that, so that there is no conflict in whatever you develop.
Yeah, I think building on Meredith's point a little, the DEI space is obviously a hot topic and it is sort of legally complicated for some of the reasons that were already outlined. And I think certainly having a vision of what the purpose is and what some of the goals are, and then using your legal knowledge to help sort of craft creative solutions to get at those goals, but bearing in mind some of the legal parameters that are out there, I think is really a way to be a super helpful partner in that context. I think also just understanding your company's level of risk. The reality is some of the legal parameters maybe aren't keeping up with the times as much. And so, you may be willing to try something new or do something a little bit differently than it's been done in the past, depending on, your company's threshold for risk. And then also just being able to understand the global differences when it comes to the DEI space, both in how it's perceived and like the cultural element, but also the legal element, which actually is quite different sometimes. And so I think just really having that knowledge base and being a partner and thinking through some of those things that might come up is a great way to help in that space.
Right, I would echo the international piece of it because there really are very different standards in other countries. And depending on whether or not you're in an organization that has a multinational presence, you really do have to have those standards top of mind so that there is an evaluation as to which areas of the company can adopt which policies, and whether or not, if they all have to align, bearing in mind what can be done in each of the respective territories in which you operate.
Yeah, that's a great point. Oh, sorry, Sharon.
You can go. I'll jump in after. Okay.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, sorry. Yeah, I think to me, this whole area, we're talking about DEI, but we're also talking about more broadly building partnerships within the organization. This is obviously an area where legal can be extremely effective by partnering with the HR or people function, especially at a company like Eden. DEI is a huge focus, and you know, something that's very important to leadership. It's something the people team is extremely focused on, and that the legal team is partnering with them on. I think one specific thought there is that you have DEI initiatives and reporting and policies, and then you also have people team initiatives that aren't specific to DEI, but we need to make sure that they take DEI into account, and just that DEI is front of mind when developing all sorts of policies. And so, for example, you know, recently, one of the many things that our people team has been working on is more robust and formalized performance management process. And so, you know, that's one of the many things that I'm partnering with them on, just to make sure that we're looking at it from the DEI angle as well, and yeah, making sure it's framed in an equitable and inclusive way. So, you know, my tip there is just to make sure you're in the loop. You know, if you're a GC, you should generally be in the loop on what your people team is working on, and make sure they are involving you in and consulting you in work streams that they may not view as purely legal, but that might have impacts that you want to hone in on.
Yeah, I completely agree, Cecile. I would also add a couple things. First of all, I find the three topics we're talking about in partnerships, DEI, ESG, and privacy data governance, are all areas where there is a definite legal underpinning, but there are much larger issues as well around ethics and other business objectives. And so they're just by their nature very cross-functional. And it's good when all of the functions that touch on them recognize that and work well together. And I think that's, you know, what leads to the best outcomes for the companies. But also because they are cross-functional, and there are a lot of issues that are not legal involved, as well as legal and sometimes quasi-legal. I think it's important for general counsels and people within legal departments working on DEI to be aware of kind of best practices overall. What are new happenings and you know, sort of cutting edge things going on? What are other companies doing? And not just kind of sticking with your legal lane in that area, or, you know, sort of checking the legal issues against what HR is doing. I think it's, you know, it's important to understand the big picture in order to do our part of the job well. And I think the more informed you are, you actually may be able to give, you know, helpful input or direction where the program is going that's, you know, outside of the legal area, because you're smart and you're, you know, you've got good experience, and now you have gotten pretty well informed about what's going on in the DEI sector.
Yeah, to Sharon's point, I think there is really a push for general counsel to have a business hat as well, to really think about the business impacts of the legal advice that's being given. And I think the more we come to the table understanding what the business objectives are and bearing those in mind in the advice that we're given, obviously, right, if there's something that's illegal, unethical, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the huge swath that's really not, right, that is really something that can and should be informed by legal, but isn't in any way running afoul of any obligations or creating any, you know, serious compliance risk. And so in those spaces, I think it is, you're embraced more by the business when you come to the table understanding what those objectives are, and when you're framing your advice and guidance in light of those objectives.
And we got a question in the chat around any recommendations on how to communicate to these other departments the importance of legal to be involved with DEI, ESG, information governance, especially HR and IT? And that's a really good question. And to me, the answer is mostly twofold. One is just being open in that communication, right? I tell people, because I think people may not realize that you want to be involved in something, or that you could be adding value to something. So just being very upfront around, hey, like if you're working on these categories of matters, please loop me in. So that's pretty simple, but I think it's important. And then two, it goes back to what Meredith was just saying, and I think other panelists as well previously, around just showing people day in, day out that when they involve you on something, you're actually adding value, and that you're thinking through an issue with them. You're not just providing legal advice from outside, but you are actually a thought partner. And you know what? Maybe someone's bringing something to you that's not actually a legal issue, but you can have ideas and be creative around how to be most effective in lots of areas. You know, for example, this has nothing to do with DEI, but when I came in, insurance was not necessarily on my list of things to worry about in my first week, but we had an insurance renewal that came up in that first week, and I realized there was a lot of duplication in our insurance portfolio that no one had really paid attention to. You could argue, you know, you don't care, it's a finance issue. Well, I actually dove in and you know, got a new broker and sort of completely rationalized our insurance portfolio, and that gave me lots of credit with our finance team and a few other teams that were involved there. And so now I think when I tell people I would like to be looped into this, people don't resist that, because they know that it's going to be helpful.
Yeah. And I second, like, really being very clear to name areas that are cross-functional by nature, and all of these are, as well as insurance, as well as equity. I mean, there's many of those kinds of things we work with day to day, and being very clear with your peers and others in the organization, like these are cross-functional issues. It is not a legal issue, or it's not a finance issue. Like, we have to work together, or this won't work well for the company, you know, for the benefit of the company. So I think that's, you know, one way to certainly to just put it on the table. Also, I've always had an interest in DEI. I started as an employment lawyer. I think that, you know, sort of that proximity to HR through my career has led to that. The Me Too movement drove that more. That's when I actually started getting involved with All Voices. So I had this kind of natural interest myself. So when at GoPro we started a diversity council, I was the executive sponsor of that. I was the most senior woman, and it was an area of interest. And since then, each company I've been at least one of the executive sponsors of the DEI work. So that gives me kind of an imprimatur of that's broader than being, you know, the legal person on the DEI issues. I'm actually, you know, overseeing the DEI program, either myself or with others within the group. And I think that kind of, you know, initiative to show that you want to be involved in a broader capacity helps give the credibility when you speak in a broader capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think related is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Obviously, it's very hot topic. It seems like the new corporate frontier, for lack of a better term. A huge topic for obvious reasons for public companies, but also impact on private companies for sure. And absolutely collaborative by name in and of itself. Sharon, I'm going to go to you on this one. I know you have experience thinking through the framework around ESG. So I'll ask you this question first. So some companies are setting up their ESG framework pretty thoroughly internally, and others are more heavily relying on outside counsel at this point. Since it is a rather kind of new area, can you speak to the GC's role in the process, or some of the factors you consider on the ESG front when you're partnering with the business side related to compliance in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think a great role, maybe not the only role, but a great role that I've played, and I think that general counsel can play, is essentially the project manager of ESG, because ESG is, you know, environmental social governance. There's a lot of topics that come under ESG, and some of them, you know, are sort of well-defined topics because you're a public company and there's, you know, certain investors that express that, or there's, you know, the industry you're in, and there's certain issues that are important to that industry. But in general, there are, you know, there are a set of issues that a company has an interest in this area, and generally the board is, you know, it's driven by the board on down. And the GC works with the board, and, you know, they're not gonna have one of the directors project manage this, and so somebody's got to do it. And it could be your head of HR, you know, it could be the GC, but since GC does the governance work, it often ends up there. And I actually think that's a great place for it to be. GC are well positioned for that, but it's also great for the GC because it gives you this, you know, view of the entire program. And you're not having to do, you know, the training that HR would normally do. They're still doing it, but you're helping to sort of manage the framework and the metrics with the board to be sure that the board's, you know, got the right visibility and in the form that it wants and needs. You know, this is, again, a very cross-functional area because ESG, there's the project management, sort of the framework of it, and then there's the individual topics, which range from governance to harassment to compliance training to supplier codes of conduct to environmental. There's just, you know, a very broad range of issues. I can't be an expert on all of those issues, but I probably need to have a certain level of understanding of each of them in order to be able to kind of project manage this framework, if you will, and to be a good advisor to the board. Now, if I haven't done that before, and that may be where, you know, having outside counsel who says they specialize in ESG, that might be, you know, somebody I turn to, versus, you know, if I've done it before, maybe I'd less likely be reliant on them. But I think it's a good service for outside counsel, particularly because it is such a hot and emerging area, and that not everybody has experience with it. But I'll just say one more thing. My last company had a pretty in-depth framework around ESG. Because the private equity company that owned us and a bunch of other companies, it was important to them that there was an ESG program in each of the portfolio companies, and they helped develop the framework and partnered with me and others to put that in place, and what metrics we would use, et cetera. So it's not just public companies, it's private companies, particularly if an investor or private equity owner thinks it's important, then, you know, you may be asked to help oversee a pretty in-depth ESG program.
Yeah, I can echo that. Yeah, this is becoming increasingly relevant for private companies. You know, in our case, we have investors who've led some of our financing rounds who have been very focused on ESG and asking for reporting in that area. So just something to have front of mind and be prepared for and not surprised by. You know, and I think customers and consumers are increasingly wanting to see that as well as employees. So you know, recent studies show that there's definitely an expectation, not just on the investor side, but also on the customer and the employee front. So it's definitely worth spending some bandwidth thinking about these issues.
Okay. And then I guess our kind of last hot topic area is data governance and privacy. And I think everybody, lawyer or not, understands the hot topicness of that these days. If you're a consumer of anything, you've seen lots of different data privacy developments over the past years, but you know, sort of different as you know, role as a lawyer, especially as a chief lawyer, right, as a general counsel. And often in this space, I know data privacy efforts can be led by a chief privacy officer, chief information security officer, who may or may not be legal. But on the legal end, the general counsel to some degree is often very, very involved. So Sharon, if you don't mind, I'll start with you on this one again. Simply your role at Acoustic is really interesting. As general counsel, you were also chief data ethics officer. You know, I don't often see that position being held by a GC a lot. So I would love to kind of hear your experience. And as a GC, what are some of your main concerns that you should be thinking about for your company more broadly in the data governance kind of privacy space?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I think each of these areas are areas where there's strong legal underpinnings, but there are sort of greater issues or goals as well on the business side and potentially the ethics side. And this is one of those areas. I think when I was at EA and privacy emerged as an area that was important, particularly in B2C companies, it definitely was seen as more of a compliance area. What do we have to do? Okay, and maybe not even okay, said the business, they might fight you, but over time, it became very clear that trust and, transparency and other things were important to consumers. And yes, those were embedded in many of the laws that exist now, but they were also just sort of accepted as kind of business realities too, that if your customers didn't trust you, they'd leave you. And if you didn't have transparency, that could blow up in a PR crisis and et cetera. So, it definitely, privacy in itself became an area that we recognized had, business aspects to it, and people in the business, like chief marketing officers, found that it was important. They should keep an eye on this and, know what's going on and work with legal. And then, things like artificial intelligence and the ethics around our use of artificial intelligence or algorithm amplification and other things that, beyond strictly privacy became issues that in how we use our data that were similar to issues in privacy, but not exactly that. And I think that's where this area of data ethics, data governance has kind of grown beyond privacy. So I kind of think of data ethics as privacy plus, if you will. It's the integrity of data practices, which absolutely involves privacy, and it involves the law around privacy, but it also involves the ethics around data usage. And that could be, as I say, an algorithm amplification, AI, but also even in privacy. You saw with Apple not that long ago, creating self-governing by creating rules that it wasn't required to create, and Google, looking at doing that too. So there is a more, self-regulation going on, not just reacting to what the legal regulations are. And I think the, companies that are out front thinking about that, thinking about what their practices are they ethical? Are they, do what the consumers expect of them? What's new in the area? What are sort of the cutting edge issues, like I talked before, and are you, staying current with that? So that's, for me, being a chief data ethics officer, first is understanding all of that I just said, but then sitting down and actually putting together a set of data ethics principles. So that was one of my major objectives last year, was what would be the company's data ethics principles, kind of putting that out to the world, using it in some ways as thought leadership and helping to support the marketing organization, where some of the benefits of that, if you will. And so, that's what I did. It had things like, trust is earned, data practices must be human-centered, consumers must be empowered, some high-level principles, and then some more detailed principles. And, that was something I got the CISO, the chief product officer, the chief marketing officer, and others, the CEO, to rally around, to know, and to advocate both internally and externally.
Yeah, just to build on that a little, and I think probably one of the themes you're seeing is where GCs can help sort of set a strategy or guide rails and principles. I think with all the data privacy laws changing as frequently as they do, and new ones coming online, and enforcement in that, I think one of the key things general counsels can help with is to build the principles, like of how you want to be as a company, what your brand stands for, especially if you're consumer facing, right? Like these things really matter to consumers a lot now. And then, you know, using those principles then to help guide, like for us, it helps guide product decisions even. And so, but knowing, having alignment from the top down of like, this is the company we want to be when it comes to our data ethics and things like that. I think that that's a really great value add, in addition to just understanding all the nuances of all the different regulations that are out there about this space. So
the only thing I would add is I think this is another area where being at a multinational organization really matters, because there is a patchwork of US domestic legislation, with California being really the most restrictive. But if you're a multinational organization and you have GDPR concerns, then that really does, that is something that has to be at the forefront. You have to think about the way your data, your domestic data, may interact with people in other countries. And so you also do, I think, from a legal standpoint, really need to focus on what the baseline framework, legislative, regulatory framework is that you're going to adhere to in establishing whatever your compliance program is, and then using those principles to get all of the other, chief product officer, marketing officer, all of the other places on board, CISO or chief technology officer if you don't have a CISO. All of those things are really, really important.
Yeah, and I'd say that's where another benefit of having a set of principles, whether you want to call them data ethics or maybe you have privacy principles, but they are trying to take all of those different jurisdictions that you work with and putting it in lay terms, what the business can understand and customers can understand, so that if you're following those, you're probably okay legally. It doesn't mean that, obviously the legal team's going to be out there looking at the compliance issues, but you don't have to go into the legal minutia as much with your business partners if you have a set of principles that essentially covers those legal requirements.
Right. And a lot of this goes back again to the overlap between preserving the legal position of the company and minimizing legal risk, and also being a company that consumers actually want to engage with, right? And so the more you're able to underscore that overlap to the business, right, and make them understand that, okay, look, this is something we need to do legally, and also no consumer is going to want to use us if we use their data in this way. I think that makes you more powerful as a GC. I want to also add, obviously we're in healthcare, so we have the additional layer of HIPAA. We're a healthcare provider, so we have very sensitive data about our patients' health. I am fortunate that I joined a company that had a really savvy information security team, and so technically I'm the privacy officer, and then we have an information security officer, and those are slightly different angles, but we partner together very closely for any sort of HIPAA, so privacy or security question that comes up. And one of the themes of this webinar was around developing partnerships, and I think that's a really important one to cultivate in this area. And the best way to do that is to be present and engage with them, and every time that an issue or a question comes up, to again be a helpful thought partner, and share knowledge and experiences, and oftentimes it's bringing it back to, okay, what would patients expect, and the ethical component of it beyond the pure legal question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main, if I had to boil it down at its most basic level, the main theme I'm hearing here today is be a strategic partner. Work hard to make sure the business understands you're not just there to keep them out of legal trouble. You are, obviously, but you're also there to help them, achieve their business goals within the parameters of a legal framework and a risk framework that your individual company is comfortable with. being mindful of time, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in chat. Otherwise, I will close with one final question. Obviously we talked about a couple hot topics that are, top of mind today. We're right on the horizon of 2022. I'm sure there's a million things on your minds, each of you every day in your jobs, but is there anything that you're thinking about heavily, coming up on the next horizon here, beyond these topics that you think are noteworthy to mention? This is all general counsels are thinking about X, or should be thinking about X maybe.
Well, I might go back to, I know we have remote discussion fatigue, but I do think as we look at our workforce and it becomes less grounded to a particular locale, we all need to be thinking about, well, how do we build a legal team and maintain and retain a legal team across localities? And should we just follow the lowest cost? Because there are, lower cost areas than the Bay Area where I live. And, does this mean with fully remote workforces that you really shouldn't live in the Bay Area because nobody's going to pay you to do that? Or vice versa, like, is that, going to lowest common denominator, there might not be as much talent in certain areas that are low cost right now, but maybe that's going to change because migration may change based on this reality. So I think it's something really, particularly people who are growing their departments need to think ahead. Like, where are they going on this? Where do they want to be? What are some of the tough issues?
I also think return to work, if you are going back into the office, and vaccine mandates, managing that. So the partnership you'll have with HR, with potentially IT, if you're going to have hoteling or some sort of hybrid, remote and in-person. So how technology is going to support your work staff if you're going to have a hybrid approach. So I think you're going to have to lean into the partnerships even more over the next year as we all figure out what the new normal is. And I would say, my biggest partners are HR, finance, IT, and because I'm at Politico, the newsroom, so editor-in-chief.
Yep, and I know we're in time, but this is a big area of focus for us as well. Also because it's not just for our own workforce, but for employers that we support under our COVID services. So I'm adding the sales team to that list of partners as well.
Yeah, we're at time, so I won't have it. I think the ESG topic is really huge and just will continue to be so. So I think we touched upon the big ones that at least I would focus on. So
wonderful. Well, I want to thank each of you. I think we can talk about every topic for hours on end. There's so much to cover, and I'm certain I could talk to each one of you for hours on end. You have tremendous knowledge. So we really, really appreciate you coming here today, sharing with us. Appreciate all of our attendees for coming out. Thank you to All Voices. Again, wonderful partner. They have a wonderful platform. If you're interested, please reach out to Christina. And thanks to everyone. We'll hopefully see you for another webinar soon. Take care.